Right, so at this point, we have mapped our system in very broad brushstrokes with these broad big boxes for the things that are involved in our content production workflow. We're now going to take a page out of Atul Gawande's book, proverbially, called The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right. And you're probably familiar with the story of this. Like, Atul Gawande is a surgeon who then realized that actually surgery is a fairly, it's one of those things that needs to be very safe. And there's all sorts of mistakes that get done when you have humans interacting with a system where there's high stress situations. So what he did was that he looked at instances like aviation and Formula One and things like that. And basically his whole book is about the idea of creating checklists as part of your system. And so when I was working in surgery, for example, we had a surgical safety checklist where at the start of every operation, you're like ticking a box of just double check the patient in front of you on the table is the patient you think you're supposed to have. Double check, what is the operation that we are doing? We are doing an amputation of the leg. What leg is being amputated? The left one. Let's draw in big Sharpie on the left leg. Like, this one is the one being amputated. Like, check. Have we given the patient the antibiotics? Have we kind of confirmed they have no allergies? Have we confirmed their consent form? Do we have their consent form? Etc., etc., etc. Then the operation will happen. And at the end of the operation, there would be another checklist around like, have we counted all the swabs to make sure there are no swabs remaining in the patient? Because that happens 1 in 10 million times, but like if it happens, it's really, really bad. So you just count the swabs. Have we made sure all of the surgical equipment is accounted for to make sure we've not left any surgical equipment inside the patient? And these are things where when it first came into practice, everyone was like, oh, come on, what is this? This is all obvious stuff. But what Atul Gawande said, and which really did change the way that healthcare was done, is that yes, it's all well and good that this stuff normally does not happen. Like normally you don't leave a swab inside a patient. Normally you don't forget that you've got a scalpel still inside the patient's body and you actually do remove it. But when this thing is happening so often all around the world, mistakes are being made. And the mistakes are not anyone's fault. It's just that there is no system in place to stop these mistakes from happening and to remind humans that, hey, you should double check this thing. So to cut a long story short, basically what we want to do next in terms of optimizing our workflow is actually convert everything into a checklist. Like, what are the different steps around organizing logistics for a podcast? What are the different steps around filming? What are the different steps around editing? What are the different steps around publishing? And the best way to explain how this works is to just give you examples of how we have made our production process more efficient over time. And I'm going to start with the podcast production system because it's a little bit more simple than the YouTube one, but then we'll talk about the YouTube one as well. And a good place to start is looking at the areas that take up the most time or that feel the most annoying. So for example, filming a podcast these days takes around 1 hour per week. But back in the day, when we first started the podcast about 3 years ago, it took a lot more time than that because there was a lot of time involved in setting up the gear. So if we just look at podcast filming, here are all the steps that involved. So firstly, we are finding the gear for the podcast, which is 2 microphones, 2 stands, and 2 cameras. And then we are setting up the mics on the tables themselves with the microphone stands and making sure everything works. Then we are setting up our 2 cameras and making sure they're on the tripod and they're on the appropriate height and the lighting is reasonable. Then we are checking the angles of the camera to make sure we look okay, which involves like going behind a camera, checking it, taking a test shot, going back, kind of testing camera angles. Then at that point, once we're happy with everything, we plug the cameras into the mains power, which is always like at random places in the house. We have to find extension cables and like plug it all in. Then we press record and we actually do the filming, which takes some time. Then because we're filming on cameras that have a 30-minute record limit, we have to keep an eye on the timer and make sure we're resetting the cameras every 30 minutes. Then once we finish with filming, we have 3 SD cards. We have an SD card from the voice recorder, from the camera number 1 and camera number 2, and we have to offload all that footage onto the MacBook. And then it comes to actually editing the podcast, which is the next step of the process. So we can see here that there's actually quite a lot involved in filming a podcast. And actually a lot of these steps used to take a large amount of time. For example, finding the gear would always take roughly 15 minutes because it would always be in a very weird position. Setting up the microphones on the table would always take somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. Setting up the camera angles would always take 10 to 15 minutes because it's like kind of hard setting up 2 cameras and making sure the angles are good. Checking the angles and making adjustments to them because we didn't have an external monitor would take another 5 to 10 minutes. Finding the appropriate length extension cable for the mains power would take at least 5 minutes, and then pressing record would, just be done. And then we're filming, and then resetting the camera angles would be quite annoying because sometimes we would forget and we would have to refilm bits, so that adds probably another 10 minutes to the process. And then offloading footage from 3 different SD cards, which are high quality footage, into a single MacBook that didn't even have an SD card slot would always take around about 30 minutes, where you're just sort of waiting for the files to transfer, swapping the SD card, waiting for another one, swapping the SD card, waiting for another one, and hoping that everything is going to work. And so what was initially meant to be just sort of like 40 minutes to 1 hour of recording a podcast has ended up being like a 2 and a bit hour long affair because of all the other faff associated with it. And when you're a creator for the first time, it's very easy to think, oh, I can record a podcast in an hour. And you don't realize just how much time you're spending doing the other bullshit like before and after you're actually recording. So now that we've checklistified the filming process of this podcast, what we can do is find all of the different ways to optimize this. And this leads us onto a subject called refactoring. Now, refactoring is a standard part that businesses use when they're sort of refactoring their processes. It's also a very common part of software development. And the idea of refactoring is that you are changing a system to make it more efficient while keeping the output exactly the same. So often, like if you're an early stage coder developing a product for a company, this is what I used to do back in the day for my own personal projects, the code that you would end up writing is very sort of like hacked together and duct taped together. We did this with our part-time YouTuber Academy, where initially there was a lot of duct tape with Google Sheets and manual processes for copying and pasting stuff from one thing to another to keep track of our students. But then over time, as software developers and as systems engineers, systems designers, we are refactoring the process so that we have exactly the same output, i.e., the software does the same thing or that students have a good experience, but you're making the process more efficient. And there's kind of 4 main ways that you can make a process more efficient. So we're going to talk about those, and then I'm going to talk about how you can introduce those into this various different production processes. Firstly, we have eliminate. And in this step, we're just looking through our checklist for each of our production thingies, and we are deciding, are there any aspects of this that I just don't need to do? What is really the value of having 2 camera angles or 3 camera angles? Does anyone actually care? What's really the value of making sure we've got the lighting set up? Does anyone actually care? Like addressing the common assumptions behind the content that we're creating, because often we're putting in work where we don't necessarily need to be putting in work. Secondly, what are the different areas in which I can remove friction from my system? Like, why is it that I'm waiting to swap SD cards out one at a time? Is there a way that I can get a 3-in-1 SD card reader so I can put all 3 SD cards in at the same time, just drag and drop them, and then that removes friction from the system? What if I already had my cameras pre-set up so I don't have to like lift the tripod every single time, which takes 3 minutes of me going behind the camera, in front of the camera, behind the camera, in front of the camera to like make sure the camera's at the right height? What if I could just remove some of the friction involved in the process? Thirdly, are there any aspects of this workflow that I can automate? This has been an area in which we've made enormous gains in our production pipeline over the last few years. Are there any aspects of the system that can be automated through software so I don't have to manually do stuff myself? And fourthly, we have the idea of delegate, which we're going to be talking much more about in the outflow section. But broadly, are there any aspects of this workflow that I could delegate to other people or to other agencies? And could I do that in a cost-effective way that's actually going to, quote, make me money in the long run? Because my time is worth a certain amount. And if I can delegate low-level activities that are worth less than the amount that I value my time at, that will free up my own time and let me do the things that I'm particularly great at. So eliminate, remove friction, automate, and delegate. Those are sort of the 4 things we want to keep in mind as we're going through our checklists to figure out how do we make our systems more efficient. So let's start with eliminate. One thing we realized when filming our podcast is that there's really no need to film it with microphones that are on stands and that are fancy microphones. And there's really no need to film it with 2 different camera angles because broadly, no one cared. And if we can just simplify it down to 1 camera angle and we could potentially use handheld mics, we don't have to do the whole faff around finding a table, finding a surface, setting up these proper microphone stand thingies. And the way our podcast was going, it wasn't so much of a priority that we had to have a world-class setup. We could absolutely cut a few corners and have a setup that was 95% as good. And no one can really tell the difference between like, a super fancy microphone and a less fancy microphone that happens to be like on a microphone stand. And so there were just aspects of this that we completely cut out. So we didn't need to set up the mics on the table. We didn't need to bother about camera angles particularly anymore. We sort of reduced that significantly because we only had 1 camera angle. We didn't really need to check the angles because we started filming with the front-facing camera of an iPhone rather than the 2 proper cameras or the multiple proper cameras we've got filming this course. We no longer had to worry about plugging the cameras into the mains power because we're filming with an iPhone and we can just plug it into a lightning cable or ensure it's got enough battery. We no longer had to reset the camera every 30 minutes because, again, when we're now filming with an iPhone, because an iPhone is good enough for the sort of podcast that we wanted, we could just have it rolling forever continuously. And as long as it didn't run out of space and didn't run out of battery, we would never need to reset it. And now we don't need to offload footage from 3 SD cards onto the MacBook. All we have to do is plug the iPhone in and transfer a single file across while also plugging in a single SD card to transfer the actual audio from the audio recorder. And so, this is more like 1 SD card plus iPhone. So it's not like a complete elimination of the step, but it's definitely a lot easier than offloading footage from 3 different SD cards. So these were all the things we eliminated when we realized, hang on, we really don't need to be filming the podcast from multiple angles and having such fancy microphones. This is something that my friend Thomas Frank, who's a big YouTuber as well, also realized with his own podcast, that he was filming it from 3 different camera angles. And when he mapped out his system, he realized how much time it was taking to film it from 3 different camera angles. And he had the assumption that, okay, well, filming from 3 different camera angles and switching between them obviously leads to a higher quality product. But then he tested that assumption. He looked into his YouTube analytics and he tried doing a few podcast episodes where they just had a single wide angle and they didn't switch camera angles at all. And they found absolutely no difference in engagement. So it was taking so long for him and his team to set up the 3 angles, make sure they're okay, and then in the edit, like actually cut between those angles. And it didn't have any effect on the overall output, at least if the engagement graphs were anything to go by. And so then Thomas decided to make the decision. He was like, okay, the fact that we have 3 camera angles and are flipping is adding an extra 5 hours a week to the production process of this podcast. Is it really worth it? The answer was no. So they just eliminated all those steps and just replaced it with a single wide angle, which is what me and my brother did as well. We didn't even use a camera. We are just shooting our content on an iPhone. The podcast is still as popular as ever because like when people are listening to a podcast, unless it's a sort of podcast that they're watching a lot on YouTube and they really care about the high production value, broadly, at least for our particular podcast, they didn't really care about having fancy angles for each of us. That wasn't really the vibe that we were going for with the podcast. It's a bit more of a chilled, laid-back conversation. Yes, if you're someone like Stephen Bartlett, who has the Diary of a CEO podcast, and you're repurposing loads of clips for social media, it's helpful having multiple angles. And now when we've started our own deep dive podcast, we do film with 3 different angles, and we try and go ham on production value, because one of the areas in which we're trying to stand out is in production value, and that's one of our unfair advantages, because we've got production capabilities and a team. But certainly with the basic podcast that I was doing with my brother, there was no need to go so overkill on all of the equipment that we had. So that was how we eliminated several steps in the process just by questioning assumptions and making decisions. Tim Ferriss has this thing like, what's one decision that will remove 100 decisions? And one decision is, let's just not film it with 3 different camera angles and let's just film it with an iPhone. Or something that Tim Ferriss says with podcasts is, maybe consider not even filming it at all if your podcast is going on audio and is not so reliant on YouTube. The next thing we want to think about is from this process, where can we remove friction? And so there's a large amount of friction in spending ages looking for the camera gear, at least when we were recording the podcast in person. And so now what we've got is recognizing that this thing was always taking an annoying amount of time, is that we have a single drawer in my living room that has the 2 microphones, the 2 XLR cables, the Zoom H6 audio recorder, and a tripod for my phone. I went out and bought an extra audio recorder and some extra XLR cables and an extra tripod for my phone, just so I could have them in my flat so that whenever my brother's around, we could potentially record our podcast. Whereas before I was like, oh, okay, did I leave the tripod at the studio? Did I leave it at home? Like, is it in my bag? Like, having the specific equipment there just for that specific thing that's always in the same place massively reduces the friction to getting things set up. In a dream world, we would have a podcast set up 100% like set up all the time, but that is a level of reducing friction that actually adds a lot of annoyance to the rest of our life, because I don't want my apartment to be filled with camera gear. And so what was a 15-minute process now takes 3 minutes to grab the gear. It's all in the same place. It's always in the same place, and setting up the angle, which always looks exactly the same. All right, let's now talk about automation and delegation. And for that, it's hard to automate and delegate filming unless you hire a videographer, which we now have, but that's probably out of access for most people. Let's talk about what the editing process for a standard podcast episode used to be like before we refactored it to make it more efficient. So firstly, we would import the footage into Final Cut using a multicam thing because we had multiple camera angles. Secondly, we'd go through and remove the pauses because pauses in a podcast are bad. Thirdly, we would combine the camera angles. 4, we would then switch between the camera angles if one of us was speaking for an extended period of time. Then we'd potentially cut out extra bits from the conversation. If there were bits that we thought were a little bit boring, we would cut them out to make the podcast a bit sharper. Then we would add background music and add some kind of fade to it. Then we would add the outro music and add that little spiel that we do asking people to leave a review. Then we'd export as an MP4 for video, which would then get published to YouTube. And then we'd export as an MP3 for podcasts, which would get published to all the podcast platforms. And again, this stuff might seem really obvious, but there are so many creators that's the absolute commonest question I get as a creator is how do you have time to do all these things? Oh, editing takes up so much time, filming takes up so much time. And I always say have you written down what your production process is? And not a single person has ever said, yes, I've written it down. So there's just something magical about writing this stuff down and writing how long it actually takes you to do each of these steps. Because you realize, oh my God, I'm spending 40 minutes going through my content and cutting out the pauses. There must be a more efficient way. And that is where the idea of automation comes in. And the great thing about automation is that you can just Google/ask people, and there's often software that helps automate a lot of aspects of the production process. So let's go through this one at a time. Importing footage into Final Cut. Okay, there's not much we can do, but the fact that we're not multicamming it anymore means we've eliminated the multicam step, we've eliminated the camera angle step, and we've eliminated the switch between angle step. And that just happens if you have a single camera angle, you don't need to worry about the others. Then there's the idea of going through and removing pauses. Now, initially when I first started editing the podcast, I was doing this manually in Final Cut, and it was taking me about 40 minutes. But then after a while, I discovered an app called Recut, where the job of the app is that you import audio or video footage into it, and it automatically removes all the pauses for you and lets you spit out a Final Cut XML file or a Premiere Pro XML file. When I discovered this, I was like, oh my God, where has this thing been my whole life? There's also an app called Descript, which we're going to use further on, which also has like an automatic pause removing feature that you can use as well. But either way, that cuts down the 40 minutes to basically 1 minute of importing footage and waiting for something to happen. So this is a prime example of how spending some money on some software, like I think Recut is like $100, saves you so much time. Like every time it saves me 40 minutes from editing and cutting out my own pauses in the podcast. Then when it comes to this stuff like adding background music, exporting, and adding outro music, and actually there's a lot of manual leveling that we have to do as well, which I forgot to include in here. There's another piece of software called Auphonic. And I found this just through Googling, I was going through all this rigmarole of editing the podcast myself, recognizing the areas of friction and thinking, someone must have found a better way of doing this. And after watching a few courses, watching a few YouTube videos, I was like, sick, there is actually software that automates a large amount of this. So the really cool thing about Auphonic is that you just give it some audio files. And then what it does is that it combines the tracks, it ducks them appropriately, i.e. if I'm speaking and my brother is laughing, it will like dampen his because it knows that I'm speaking. It automatically lifts up the levels to like -16 LUFS, which is like podcast standard. And it spits out an MP3 and a WAV file, which I can then just sync with my video. And now I have a beautiful sounding podcast where I have not had to do anything. Auphonic automates all of it and costs like $7 a month, which again is totally worth it because it's eliminating steps, it's reducing friction, it's helping us automate things so that we can save our own time. Now, when it came to this removing the extra bit stage, what we realized after a while is that actually we don't need to cut too much from the podcast. It can broadly be an unedited conversation, unless we say something that is really potentially cancelable, in which case I'll know in the back of my mind, red flag, and then we'll go in and edit it. Generally, we don't actually need to remove bits. And what we did is that we polled our audience and said, hey, how do you feel if the episodes are a bit longer and a bit more rambly? And a large amount of the response was people saying, hey, we don't really listen to the podcast because it gives us actionable value in a small amount of time. We listen to the podcast because we enjoy hearing the two of you have a chat. So we don't really mind if the podcasts are a bit longer. In fact, sometimes we prefer if the podcasts are a bit longer. And so we thought, you know what? We're spending so much time going through the podcast and like making sure all the bits are like sharp and precise and stuff. We don't need to do that. We can just have the conversation, and that completely eliminated that removing extra bit step. Like I said, unless we knew we had said something that was potentially cancelable and therefore removing that from the episode recording. At one point while doing the podcast, we decided we wanted to share our clips to social media to help grow the podcast. So there was a step before exporting as MP4. And that step involved going through the podcast, like clipping out the bits that we liked that we would turn into social media clips, and then creating a new project, making it 9:16 so it's vertical, copying and pasting the footage, increasing the size of the footage, making sure it worked, adding a progress bar, all that kind of stuff. But then a few months into this, Premiere and Final Cut released like a video automatic resizing feature, whereby with a single click, you can resize a video for social media. And then we discovered an app called Subly, which automatically helps convert it into clips. And so those were other ways in which this like otherwise manual process was able to be automated. And the cool thing about being creators is that most of the stuff we do is digital, and beyond the initial creative element, a lot of the steps afterwards, people have made software that helps you automate a large amount of the steps in it, or you can just choose to eliminate some of the steps in it without really changing the quality of the final product, which is this idea of refactoring that we're talking about. And then finally, we come to the idea of delegation. We're going to talk much more about delegation in the outflow section. But for example, there are services that help, for example, delegate the entire production pipeline process for a podcast, where they have a sound engineer who's audio engineers it, they'll publish it for you, they'll turn it into a video. Yes, you do have to pay for those services, but it ends up saving you time. And one of the things we're going to talk about in the delegation section is that if you can ever outsource something for less than your own personal hourly rate, you probably should, because you can use that time to then do more effective things that actually grow your own revenue in the business. So these days, actually, I don't really do any of this stuff myself. If I have a podcast that needs editing, unless it's like Christmas Day or unless it's like a weekend and I don't want my team to work, I'll just put it in a Google Drive folder, say to my editor, Christian, be like, hey, new podcast episode's up. And then he'll go through all the steps and deal with the editing and the publishing and the repurposing, which is awesome. So I've delegated that aspect of it away, but we're going to talk much more about that side of things in module 3 of the course. Okay, so that was a very long kind of overview of what that looks like on filming the podcast and editing the podcast. I'm just going to blitz through some of the different areas in which we found like efficiencies to refactor the system for video production as well. One of the main ones was in filming, where I realized that it was taking so long to actually set the cameras up and the tripod up that I realized I could actually just leave the camera attached to the tripod, just fold the legs of the tripod inwardly and store it behind my door. So now that when I need to film a video, I literally just grab my tripod. It's already at the perfect height and I can just plonk it in front of my desk and film a video. When it came to filming the podcast, I was also manually sorting out the camera settings every time. And I realized it was taking me 5 to 10 minutes to set up the camera settings each time. And so I just Googled best camera settings for Sony a6500, and I found a thing that let me save it as like one of those memory profiles on the camera, which meant that I could just turn the camera to that memory setting and be ready to go, which saved 5 or 10 minutes of my time each time. I also found that I was spending absolutely ages trying to get the perfect angle set up. And the reason for that was that the a6500 did not have a flip out screen, so I could never see myself. And so one thing that I did to refactor that process to make it a bit more efficient was that I bought an external camera monitor, which would sit on top of the camera so that it would allow me to see myself. These days, most people don't have that issue because most cameras do in fact have a flip out screen. But I'm just trying to give you an idea of the thought process behind kind of whenever you recognize a source of friction in your production workflow, really thinking, can I reduce this friction somehow? When it comes to editing, I don't edit my videos anymore because I have an external editor, but we know a bunch of students in our YouTuber Academy who really enjoy using the app Descript, because what Descript does is that it lets you edit your videos as if it's a Word document. It will transcribe your video, and then you can drag and move stuff around. You can get rid of mistakes, get rid of pauses, all that kind of stuff. And then it will let you export it as a Final Cut or Premiere Pro XML file, which you can then do the proper editing with, adding B-roll, all that kind of stuff. And loads of our students have found that adding in Descript, rather than just trying to manually edit all of the pauses and all of the mistakes out themselves, has saved an enormous amount of time in their production workflow, and that is absolutely a thing worth spending money on. We also decided to create a whole new system around idea generation, and this is like a whole session for 2 hours that we teach the students on our part-time YouTuber Academy. But in the next session, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of how we built a system around this output of generating important ideas that we wanted. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview with a bunch of different examples of how we think about like elimination, reducing friction, automation, and delegation. Like this is going to vary depending on what your personal production process looks like. But I'd highly recommend you actually kind of map it out first in broad brushstrokes. And then for the bits where you're spending the most time, actually take the time, checklist manifesto style, to write out what are all the different steps in this standard operating procedure, as it were. And then you can decide which steps you want to eliminate, which steps you want to reduce friction for, which steps you want to potentially automate and delegate. And I promise you, if you do this, you will probably find efficiencies in your system that you can just like get for free without having to spend too much time or spend too much money thinking about it. And then you will get free time. You will free up your time to be able to do things that are higher leverage, higher value for your own business. So thank you for watching. And in the next lesson, we're going to go through a case study of idea generation. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.